is going to be our second last free webinar, just because I've noticed that now that the weather's nice, people are wanting to get outside, but they really appreciate the recordings. So
yes,
that's why I make sure this is working.
Yeah. No, that's good. That's good.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's definitely tricky times. I mean, it goes back to, I think I talked about this last time. I mean, I always come back to resilience, right? And it's not just resilience in our kids, it's resilience in ourselves. And there's so much pressure on parents, and even more so with COVID, right? Because now a lot of FSCD services, well, it's not FSCD itself because they are still there, but service providers, especially if you've got younger kids who are intervention, and even older kids who are accessing therapists and things like that, a lot of that was put on hold, plus the schooling piece. So this was a really tricky time because so much pressure was put on parents. But when we look at successful people and successful families and any success story, I think the example I was even using was Cinderella last time, right? Nobody does it on their own. Any big Hollywood movie you look at the tragedy, tragic situation, this person came and now they're superheroes or whatever it is. There's always a team of people. And so that's my focus on, we need to make sure we have a strong support network, right? You need to have your team. I know that there was, one time there was an emergency and I needed someone to pick up my daughter for me from school because I can't remember what the emergency was. I just remember the situation. And I remember realizing, I have nobody. There is nobody, just because I've worked so much and I've cut off all my connections, and I literally had nobody to pick up my daughter for me. And I think that was a huge call to me about, we need as parents to have that strong support network, whatever that looks like. Yes, there's going to be professionals, but in that drop of the hat, who would you call, right? Some of us are lucky enough to have family members here in Calgary. But I find, especially within the autism families, a lot of them move to Alberta away from family and friends. And we've got families from all around the world to come and access, because up until now, we've had really good funding, right? And so a lot of these families don't have anybody. And so we need to, if you don't have that person that you could drop your kids off or would come pick up your kids or take you to the hospital or anything like that, that's what you need to start doing. So that's kind of the foundation first, right? I think then parents are going to hate me for saying this because we hear it all the time, but the self-care piece is really huge too. We know the analogy, you got to put on your own mask before you can put on your kids if you're in the airplane, because you're going to pass out from and even die from not having enough oxygen, and you're no good to anybody. And if we can't, especially when we've got these kiddos with huge emotion dysregulation, who have aggressive behaviors, self-injurious behaviors, that's really hard to manage. If we can't regulate our own emotions and be strong for our kids, right, it's going to be really hard. And oftentimes we make behaviors worse. And I think, and I'll get into some of the behavioral pieces in a minute, but I think that's a huge piece, right? Us being able to take self-care. And it's interesting. I used to do a lot of research around families. I was going to help develop a whole counseling program for different agencies, like low cost, in an adjunct with some of the funding agencies. And I even had students, and we were offering free counseling to parents, and no one wanted to take us up on any of these services. It was really interesting. I know, right? I mean, this was a few years ago, but all of the parents that we had talked to, because I was working closely with some agencies, all of the parents said, you help my child and that's going to help me. I don't need the counseling. I would rather use my psychology hours or whatever to go towards my child. Right. And that's I think that's huge, because all of these families are struggling. If you've got more than one child, if there's a sibling, if they've got special needs, well, I mean, now you've got, you're lots of needs that you need to address. But even if you've got typically developing kids, those siblings have just as many needs as the child with autism. I do a lot of work with siblings. Actually, their needs are usually greater than the child with autism most of the time. There's a lot of considerations, and we put a lot of stresses on them as well. And so it's really interesting to see, parents are struggling with coping but they weren't taking those supports for themselves. And I think that we really need to be able to take a step back and say, whoa, what is it that I need? And especially now with COVID, I think parents are nonstop. Everybody was at home full time. So it was not only just dealing with our kids' behaviors and with schools. Now we have all the messes to clean up because our kids are home all the time. They're eating all their meals at home, right? And so I think just that stress for a lot of families made it to a breaking point. And now maybe parents are recognizing, okay, I do need support, and I do need to do some self-care, and maybe need to reach out for counseling or whatever it is, especially with COVID. But that's, the greatest thing is, what do I need for myself today so that I can cope with whatever it is that's going to be thrown my way? That's the first step. Because you think when you have had really good days and you're at your best, I find that we can take whatever it is our kids throw at us.
It's
Really.
absolutely true. I love that you've brought this up, because this is exactly my philosophy on resilience. And have experienced it. When we were in the middle of a mental health crisis, it wasn't my son needed support too, absolutely, but it was me. When I became when I got help, when I got counseling, when I changed, when I made adjustments that helped me in my emotional regulation, my home changed, and my son was able to get help and improve.
Yeah.
And so, you're right. We often don't think of that. And I think parents, well, we're just trying to survive, right?
Yeah. Well, and that's the thing. But again, there's so much pressure on parents. So when we talk about resilience, it is we've got the child, and then we've got the parents, and then we've got the schools, but it's a bigger, it really goes to the government. And there's been so many times I'm like, I'm going to run for government. I'm going to be, run for the Minister of Education, or if not that position, something to do with education. Just because I think that there are so many things that we need in place for us to be able to support us. I mean, with all the budget cuts, PUF funding is in trouble, right? With all the cutbacks that have gone to those little guys who had early intervention and PUF through school and up until kindergarten, it's gone, right? And a lot of service providers, they're getting rid of their speech paths and OTs and psychologists and behavior supports. So, everybody's going to be under a lot of stress. So, but that's not what we need. That's not what parents need, is more pressure on them, right? So I think it's as much as it's easy to say, okay, parents, you got to take care of yourselves. I think there are bigger issues. But until those things are addressed, what we can do within our scope of control, right? It's looking at, how am I supporting my network? So it's great that you've got this Brave Parenting, right? You've got this platform, you've built this community, and if parents can be involved in this community and hear other people's stories, and if you can support one another and all of those types of things, I think that's huge. That's going to be really important. And even looking back, if we do get back into some of those behavioral things, when we are stressed, if we don't have enough sleep, when we don't have good coping strategies, we're actually inadvertently making behaviors worse, right? And well, you said it yourself, when you were healthy and happy, you were able to control, manage your own emotions, and then you're able to better support your child. And that kind of goes hand in hand. A lot of families, I say, yes, do what you need to do to survive, because I think that's where a lot of parents are. They're in survival mode. I'm very visual, so I can just see, a lot of parents, their nose, just the tip of their nose is out of the water, and that's about it. Otherwise, they're drowning. And I think that's true for so many parents and families right now. And so we do the things that we need to do. If that means our kids are on screens for, an extra few hours so that I can get these things done and make dinner and just have some peace and quiet, I think that's kind of where we're at. And that's okay. But we just got to know that that's what we're going to do. If we want to work on these behaviors, like I always tell parents, what's most important? If we could make one change now that would make all the difference in your life, because as parents, we would be guilty about everything. My kids should be doing this, and they shouldn't be on screens, and they should be doing that, and I shouldn't be, we should all over ourselves, right? That's what ends up happening. And so I say, if we could focus on one thing, so yes, maybe you don't want your kids on screens right now, but it's doing that cost benefit analysis, right? If there is one thing. Now, if that one thing screens, then we got to work on it, right? Then we can't one day just let them be on screens all day, because when we let it go one day or here and there, we could be reinforcing the behavior, right? And so that's where it's tricky. That's why I always try to break it down. Just one thing that 100% of the time you can follow through on, so we're not making it harder for you, right? In the long run. And so I often have families start there, so maybe it's bedtime, maybe it's dinner time, focusing on those critical areas where they're feeling stressed, or where they might be fighting with their kids, or whatever else is going on, right? And then being able to work in baby steps, one thing at a time from there. So that's what I encourage a lot of parents to do, is figure out, okay, one part of my day, if I could make it a smidgen little better, what could I do? And then it's about creating that plan that you can be consistent with and follow through with. Especially when we're looking at kiddos with autism. I mean, all kiddos will push back, especially if we do things differently the first time. We see that behavior burst, right? Where it gets worse before it gets better. But if we're able to be consistent with whatever it is, maybe it's implementing a bedtime routine, for example, then kids will push, realize, no, there's no changing this. That's the routine that's in place. And then the behaviors kind of decrease. But it's those times where we do slip up, and okay, maybe you can stay up a little bit extra. You can have your iPad a little bit longer. That's called intermittent reinforcement. And it actually makes the brain, it's like the slot machines in Vegas. People will go and they'll play the machines day in and day out, over and over and over again, just for that chance of, I won. And then that one jackpot, it's enough to just reinforce that behavior. So we want to make sure that we're not doing that. So I keep talking about screens, but when it comes to things like screens, that's why we want a lot of predictability. The same place, the same time, for the same amount of time, every time they're on that iPad, for example, just so that and kids with autism like that predictability anyways. So those types of things can be really helpful when we have routines and things like that. So.
Oh, that's good. That's good. And then I just want to mention to anyone attending, at any time, write down a question. Because, like I said, we have Dr. Caroline here for a limited amount of time. And so, here she is, and volunteering her time. What a gift. What a beautiful gift we're so thankful for. And so by all means, please. I struggle with the spectrum as a parent. So one of my child's diagnosis is slight, back in whatever year that was, it was slight Asperger's, which means he's very low on the spectrum. And there's times when I'm like, I don't understand how to work with that. Like, this is the one area that I can say with confidence that I have no confidence in.
Right.
Right. Like, it often comes out for my son in speech. Doesn't really have a filter.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And does he also have ADHD? Does he have a dual diagnosis? Yeah.
Oh, and ODD too.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, there's actually a lot of kiddos on the spectrum, whether mild all the way to severe, who actually also have comorbid ADHD. Now, not all of them are identified as having ADHD, but there is a huge proportion of autism. Now, just because you have ADHD doesn't mean you have autism, but chances are if you have autism, you also have ADHD. So it's kind of a double whammy in terms of those executive functions. That's the prefrontal cortex, where our planning, making good decisions, filtering what we're going to say, organization, all of those things, it's delayed. So it won't fully develop in our kiddos until well into adulthood. And if they have both diagnoses, so I think that's the hard part. And especially with the high functioning kiddos who do have language, and as they get older, we expect so much more of them. We kind of forget that they've got these deficits, right? And it's a double whammy. So the autism makes the ADHD worse, and the ADHD makes the autism worse. And it actually makes, and then if they're emotional, even over just losing a game, something like that, you know, and they get frustrated, they regress quite significantly. Doesn't matter how, even if they're 14, 18 years old, they're regressing behaviorally and emotionally. And that makes it really hard for parents, because a lot of us are like, you should know better, especially as they get older. And when they are, especially, you know, the bright kiddos, right? Because a lot of these kids really are gifted or you know, high intelligence. So I use the analogy, I mean, with co-regulation, if you used a glass, I don't have a glass on me right now. We look at, actually, I could probably do a drawing, maybe. We'll see how this drawing goes. I show a chart where our regulation kind of goes like this. So from babyhood, oops, this way, babyhood all the way up to adulthood. So I'm going against the grain here, ooh, that way. But when we have these dips in here, parents, it's almost like your full cup, right? So when they're babies, it's down here. Their ability to regulate, whether it's their emotions, making good decisions, filters, all of those things, it's empty. So if you think of a glass, it's empty. We have to do everything for them. They will cry, let us know if they're tired or hungry or anything like that. So we fill up the rest of the glass, right? So then when you're looking at a graph like this, right? So even if they're here, and as they get older, you see these dips. So when they're teenagers, there's dips. We still need to fill the rest of that space for them. And so, and especially as they're getting older, you know, we, well, should be able to. If we also have ADHD or things like that, we're going to be delayed too. But we need to monitor whether it's their behavior or emotion regulation, that filter, all of those types of things. We need to fill the rest of the cup. So if they can only regulate up to here, we got to fill up the rest of that. So a lot of it's being proactive. Now, I know we can't always guess when our kids are going to freak out or they're going to say something inappropriate or things like that. But as much as I always talk about being on offense, right? We got to be on offense with whether it's with behaviors or anxiety or anything that we're really dealing with. So part of it is, well, we can use your son's. What are some examples of things that he might say? Like if just saying it's something inappropriate that could be offensive to someone, is that kind of what would happen?
Yeah. And, you know, some of it's very admirable. Like he doesn't just fall for things that are going on in the world. Like he doesn't just, yeah, he's just a nonconformist. Where he kind of goes over the line is he will intentionally go into Instagram chats and provoke people who are kind of in that echo chamber. You know, they're all saying the same thing and they're all standing up for something. And he goes in there with a counter statement and doesn't care.
Okay. So that's part of, I mean, especially our bright, higher functioning kids just like to be nonconformists, right? And that's kind of part of being on offense there. It's teaching him about being a digital citizen, and with privileges of things like going on Instagram also has responsibilities. I talk a lot about that in terms of consequences with behaviors, right? And when we're looking at natural versus logical consequences that actually work and teach our kids. So if there's a problem, if he's creating problems and he's not being a good, you know, digital citizen, for example, well, that's his responsibility to do. I will give you the privilege of allowing you to go on Instagram or having access to devices that will get you on Instagram, but your responsibility must be fulfilled, right? And so then it's a matter of, if you don't fulfill that agreement, it's just like us in real world. If we're not following the law, we might get a ticket for speeding, or we might get thrown in jail for doing something we shouldn't be doing. So your privilege will be taken away because you don't have the responsibility. You're not showing that responsibility to be allowed to have those types of things. Other times, you know, I do have kiddos with highly predictable behaviors, you know, for example, a child who just has to pull long hair, right? There's just these impulses that are just so overwhelming. I even get that too. I have ADHD too. And I'll have moments where I'm just so flooded with love that I just need to bite my kids. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I need to bite you. And they're like, Mom, please don't bite me. And I would never bite them hard. But so I get it. We get so flooded. Our brain is flooded with emotion, and even sometimes positive emotion, right? Like love or whatever it is. I think there's something called a cuteness aggressive disorder. I'm sure I have it. If it's a real thing, I've got it, because anytime I see something cute, like I just need to punch something. But anyways, we have these impulses, right? That's my ADHD at its best. But we have these impulses. So it's actually putting our kids in those situations, and then they have to practice the skills or strategies that we've taught. And I've talked about this before, you know, so if you've got two brothers who are at each other all the time, and one is maybe a little older and does like really intricate Lego buildings or whatever, and the other one likes to come smash the Lego, you know, we are going to put the older kiddo in the situation that we're going to have him build a small little Lego thing, purposely have his brother come and smash his Lego. And his job is to stay cool, to not hit his brother, right? To go find something else to do instead. So we're actually practicing through those situations. And so with your son, an example might be, you know, going through Instagram and looking at things that might provoke him to want to provoke others, right? And what will you do instead? What would it be a good choice be? And practicing those situations. I had one little girl that I was working with, this was years ago, who she was always getting in trouble in school, constantly getting, going to the principal's office, really starting to feel pretty defeated about herself. But she loved doing different responsibilities around the school. So having little special jobs. And that's a huge part of resilience too, is feeling like I'm doing something valuable and contributing. And so she loved those jobs. And her favorite job was to hold the door at recess time so students could come in. The only problem was she was so impulsive, she could not stop herself from tripping the kids as they walked in the door, because she just thought it was so funny to trip the kids. And so, of course, the first reaction is, well, you can't have that job anymore. And so there was a lot of threats to her. Hey, kiddo, you know, we're getting one more time, three X's and you're out. No more holding the door. And she wanted to. She was motivated. She was so motivated to hold that door. She didn't want to trip, but in the moment she could not stop herself. That impulse just came and she just had to do it. And so what we ended up doing is we took a step back and saw that this was a problem, but knew it wasn't because she was a bad kid, right? She just couldn't control herself. And so what we ended up doing is just small structured practices where we would go out and we said, okay, we got to give you something to do with your feet in your hands. So we're giving her a replacement behavior. Oftentimes we just say no tripping or no hitting, but our brain processes in an ironic way. We all know, you know, if I say, don't think of a white bear, whatever you do, don't think of a white bear. You can do nothing but think of a white bear, but we're always using this language where we're phrasing behaviors in the negative. So we need to phrase what we do want them to do. So what is she going to do with her hands and feet instead, right? And so she had this mantra, one hand on the door, one hand in my pocket, both feet on the ground, and she'd stomp, stomp. And we would actually trace outlines of where her feet needed to be, one hand in her pocket, one hand on the door. And we even practiced without days when she didn't have a pocket, she would just have one hand on her hip, right? And so she would just practice that. That would be her mantra that she would say over and over and over through all of recess. One hand on the door or holding the door, one hand on the door, one hand in my pocket, both feet on the ground. So she had that mantra. She knew what she had to do with her behaviors. And then we would practice with just a couple of kids. And we want whatever new behavior, I always say it's got to touch reinforcement really quickly. So she needs to experience success automatically. We're not going to wait for her to fail, right? We're not going to wait all of recess and hope that she doesn't slip up. We're going to make sure she doesn't slip up. So we'll just have one or two kids go in the door while she's doing her mantra, doing her the other behaviors that she needs to be doing, and then immediately reinforce her. Kiddo, you let all the kids in, even though there's only two. We don't say that. You let all the kids in. You didn't trip anyone, right? You had one hand on the door, one in your pocket, and we reinforce that. So then she's motivated and has experienced, hey, I can do this. And then we would slowly increase the amount of kids. And then we'd go to recess time where she can hold the door, but maybe it's not for the whole recess. It's just the beginning or just the first grades or whatever it is, until she was able to successfully do that. And we kind of need to do that with these big behaviors, right? Give that replacement behavior and a mantra or whatever it is that they're going to do, and immediately reinforce them. So if I talk about sibling rivalry, if you know your kids can only get along for about 10 minutes before they start fighting, when we're working on sibling rivalry, for example, we're not going to put them in there for the 10 minutes, right? We're going to maybe only put them in for 3. That way they can learn, hey, we can have a successful period of time together where it doesn't end in a fight. Because that's usually what we do. Oh, they're getting along so good. It's been an hour. Wow, they're doing amazing. And we just let them go until they fight. Right? And that's often what happens with any behavior. We let them go until they're in trouble. So let's get them go and jump in while we can all end with success, right? And I think that that's a big piece.
That's really good. Because that's exactly what we do. Because we don't know this stuff. And I find this funny because I'm listening to you going, well, this just sounds like parenting. And I think sometimes we overcomplicate it. We think, oh, like autism, like maybe this is just so much more intense, but it's sounding no, this is parenting.
It is. Yeah, it is. And I mean, some kids just need more help, right? Some kids, we can just give a replacement behavior. I mean, both of my kids have ADHD. And so I know that I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm gifted, right? So I'm like, you guys know better, blah, blah, blah. And I think that's why it's so much more frustrating, I think, for a lot of parents who do have higher functioning kiddos on the spectrum, just because we forget that they should know better and we should just be able to teach them once. But they need lots of repetition. So I think that's the biggest difference. We can't just tell them. A lot of kids learn vicariously, whether it's through experience, ooh, I said this thing and mom got mad, so I'm not going to say that thing again. Our kids, whether with autism or ADHD, executive functioning deficits, they don't learn. They don't have that hindsight and foresight, right? They're kind of time blind. So they're not thinking about, ooh, I said that thing. They can't remember that to then guide their behavior. They're literally in the moment, in the moment, in the moment. Now, when you've got lower functioning kiddos, like I know a lot, this is the thing, there is a lot of other stresses when it comes to stimming behaviors, right? Or a lot of my kiddos on the spectrum will go and dump, they're dumpers. So they'll go and dump any liquid. So whether it's milk or shampoo or toothpaste, and they'll dump it all down the sink or all over the house, right? And they need constant supervision. I find that, those kiddos definitely have their other stresses, but it's almost a little bit easier because we know that they're lower functioning and they need a lot more support, and they usually do have a lot more support. I know a lot of our lower kids who needed constant supervision still had behavioral aids and respite and things, even through COVID. They had people coming into the house and supporting them. But not all families get that support, right? And so behavior is behavior, right? Whatever it is that we're looking at, and it is a lot of the same strategies. And it is us as parents being able to be strong enough to implement what we need to, and then do these structured practices and learning about the consequences and everything like that, just as effectively as anybody, right? I think we're actually better parents if we have kids with exceptional needs,
Because we have
because
to.
we have to. We absolutely have to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's yeah, we can't cheat anything. That's one of the things I love about my kids is that they make it so that like I have no choice but to parent them this way. And when I
Right.
don't, and when I don't take care of myself, we all pay for it. So
Yeah. Yeah.
it's there's a couple of comments in here I'm noticing, which is great because people I think people when we're listening and I know for me I'm really like taking it all in and like Jody mentions that her son with autism, you know, just says things like he feels and without regard and so I'm really glad you covered that and um Sharon says that her son has ADHD and his ASD assessment is this Friday. And Trish says that has totally been her frustration with having a high functioning kiddo. He doesn't disrupt, so he gets overlooked. And so, how can we help them get noticed?
Yeah. I just wanted to go back to the first one you had mentioned. I think what was this is my ADHD. I forget. My working memory is shot. She had said, he blurts out, oh, I know. I've got some high functioning kiddos, especially on the spectrum. They're all about rule boundness, right? There's right versus wrong. And they just gotta say or do things. And I find a lot of them get in trouble because they see rule breakers, right? Even to us, we're like, that wasn't even anything. Like, but in their mind, they have all these rules and expectations that people might break, right? And so, and we might not even know what some of their own rules are. We might, move their fork 2 degrees to the right too far or something like this sometimes, right? Some of their rules can be so irrational, but then it results in these huge behaviors. Or with other kids, they're going to beat them up or being a tattletale or whatever it is that's going on. So again, it's finding a replacement behavior and putting them into practice. So I had one kiddo who's pretty high functioning, and he would look for everybody who's talking if the teacher was talking, who walked too quickly in the hallways, all of those sorts of things. And what we had him do was write an X on his hand, so that he could still acknowledge, because I was saying it's not a big deal, it's not a big deal. It was always a big deal for him. And so we tried tons of different things, but that seemed to work, that he could still physically do something to acknowledge that person has really ticked me off. Now we started with one of those golf counter, and he actually wore it like a bracelet, so it had beads. So anytime someone did something wrong, he could move a bead. He would do the X and then move a bead. So that way he could track how many wrongdoings were happening at school in a day, and then he could go and debrief them with someone at the end of the day. So it was just helping create some of that impulse control in the moment, that I'm still acknowledging it and I can still do something about it, and justice still might be served later on, but just not in that moment that's going to cause a conflict with friends, right? Or whatever else is going on. So those are the types of things that we need to do to help support them. So that, because just saying it's not a big deal isn't going to be enough, because it's always going to be a big deal for them in the heat of the moment. Later on, they might rationalize, you're right, that wasn't a big deal. I don't know why I did that. But that impulse comes over. Like I said, I'm a grown adult, in my 40s, and I still have impulse control issues, right? And I don't have autism, but the ADHD, executive functioning difficulties makes it really hard. And so we need to find something else that we can do. And they just don't know what. They're usually told, grow up, don't hit, or whatever it is, but they actually need to be able to practice those types of things. So, yeah, I think that replacement behavior, and I can't remember the very last one. So someone had ADHD, is going for an autism diagnosis, and then the frustration of just having.
And then just feeling like overlooked, like how do we get these kids noticeable? Because you're right, like they look fine and they even act fine. And like you said, they're very smart.
I remember my first time, I was frontline, this was back in the 90s, frontline working with a little girl with autism who looked like my daughter. She had big blue eyes and blonde hair. And we were working on, she was kind of mid-spectrum. So she was just learning language. She was 4 years old, just learning language. And I remember we were just waiting on being able to wait in lines because her mom couldn't take her to like a grocery store, for example. And we were waiting in a line at a post office. And she dropped to the ground doing her normal freak out. So tantruming and screaming. And the amount of people and stares that I got, like, can't you control your child? It was really interesting. So I think that we have that stress, but she is a kiddo that, so from the outside, she looked normal. She didn't look like anything's wrong. She was this beautiful little girl. And I think that these are hidden diagnoses that I think are really hard for a lot of parents, whether it's autism or ADHD, because something like Down syndrome, for example, it's not hidden. We can see those things, right? And I think it's hard on so many different levels, especially when we're out in public, but it could even be with family, right? Especially if we've got a kiddo who is high functioning, who's looking good, and grandparents are like, there's nothing wrong, right? And I think just society's expectations. We are our kids' greatest advocates. There's a fine balance. We have to be a squeaky wheel to make sure that our kids are getting their needs met, but not such a squeaky wheel that nobody wants to work with us either, because that happens, unfortunately. If you're a really hard parent to work with, it just becomes an eye roll for everybody and nobody wants to deal with you. And then you're getting phone calls all the time from the school or agencies. And, we don't want that to happen either. So it's finding that balance of how do I work with you? So we do this with the teachers quite a bit with my girls, because my girl is very high functioning and she's very anxious. And so she's the one who will sit really nicely and quietly in class. Meanwhile, she's not learning anything. She's making really bad decisions. And then out on the playground, all her friends are hating her. Like, it's just mounting and mounting and mounting, but she's not getting any extra support. And so, when it comes to schools and teachers, we're usually, we kind of stroke their ego a little bit. So we always ask teachers, what's your teaching philosophy, right? And usually it's not in parent-teacher interviews. Like whenever we have like a barbecue at the beginning of the year, right? We'll go, or those open houses at school. That's when we just kind of casually say, how did you get into teaching, right? So we start asking teachers about themselves, because we all have stories and we all like talking about ourselves. What's your teaching philosophy? And then we'll slowly, gradually go into, well, how do you manage behaviors, or how do you identify those kiddos who maybe aren't getting, who aren't behaving? And we get in that way so now we've created that opening so we could start talking about our own kids' needs. Now it is tricky with all the budget cuts, and I think this year it's worse than ever before, unfortunately. So, I know teachers do have their hands tied, but it's a matter of, I always say at the beginning of the year, even if you've had an assessment and it's been in your child's file at school, for example, you got to let teachers know at the beginning of the year. So it's always that open communication, being able to talk with them. They've got a diagnosis. These are the things that have worked in the past. I want to be able to work with you, right? And I'm worried about my kiddo kind of falling through the cracks. And these are the things that I know that we can do together to kind of help. I think that that's really important. You coming every year with your own little booklet of strategies that can help or not help. And especially because a lot of our kids, even if they're high functioning and they're talking and all of that, they can't process. They don't know what the most salient thing is in the day. So that means something big could happen. They could have been sent to the principal's office, or I have an example of my daughter. They had, it was a year ago. So like the 2019 school year, 2018, 2019 school year. And they had the Mothers Against Drunk Driving come in. And she was traumatized by the experience. They did a presentation and they had people come in, and she was traumatized. And I guess she had nightmares, and she had been crying for like a week at a time. She just told me this year, even though it had happened, but she didn't think, right? This is the ADHD. In that time, she didn't think that that was important, right? and I'd ask how her day, oh, it was fine, right? But then she'd go and have a nightmare and all of these things happened. It's like she didn't click in. It wasn't until this year someone had mentioned about Mothers Against, and she's like, oh my goodness, I remember them, Mom, I got to tell you what happened. So it's not that she didn't want to share it with me. It just wasn't important at that time. It wasn't salient. And we'll have kids, like we practice this with our kids, where we'll have them go out to the secretary, and the secretary will have like big glasses and a funky hat or something outrageous. And their job is to be able to come back and report to us what they saw or what happened, right? Or we would do something super mean, like we would have them carrying like a toy, and the secretary would grab the toy from them, right? But almost 100% of the time, the kids would come back and we're like, what happened? What'd you see? And they're like, nothing. Or, there was a pencil on the ground, or they just don't think about the important things that we as parents are trying. And I think that's frustrating as well, right? So we can't really rely on our kids to let us know how the day actually is going. Sometimes they will, but oftentimes if they do share anything, it's overly negative. They'll say all these bad things happened, but then the teacher's like, well, no, nothing happened. I'm kind of going on a rant here, but the point is it's us having that communication with whoever it is, whether it's our service provider, if you have an FSCD worker, making sure, they're under a lot of stress too, but being able to have that communication and regular check-ins. But you are the leader, right? You're the leader of the pack. So you really need to know what it is you need as a family, what it is your child needs. Because if you don't know, it's going to be really hard for anybody else to know. And I think that comes back down to that whole advocacy piece, right? There are certainly agencies out there, like Autism Calgary has been amazing on so many fronts in managing how do you deal with FSCD, for example, or just learning how to advocate. There are agencies out there. There's Children's Link, but Autism Calgary specifically for our kiddos with autism, they can really help you learn to advocate.
It's probably, for some parents, it's probably just the learning curve of this that feels so overwhelming. And then having to navigate the day by day as we do this. You're saying all these great things and we're all like, yes. But I think to remind the parents that, just hearing what we can do and not what we should do, but like what, like taking care of ourselves, remembering that, these are, what did you call it? An executive functioning deficit. Mm-hmm. That's really what this is all around. This is a commitment to the long term. It's not going to be fixed by tomorrow. I know for me, when we were kind of in the heat of all of this, I was just like, okay, somebody, and maybe this is what you're referring to at the beginning, somebody just take my kid, fix him, and send him back to me. But that's not what's going to happen. You're right. Like, we're the leaders and we're in this navigating, and it's going to be messy and we're not going to get it right. And that's okay. Like, I've flown on the spectrum with school of going from being like super like, whatever you think, teacher, whatever you think, to now almost going to the other spectrum, like, here, I'm coming in with the plan. This is what works. And feeling the ego has been hurt by the teacher. So I think what you've said there is really important, like coming in like we're a team. I'm here to advocate. I'm here to hear your heart too, instead of just coming in with, this is what my kid needs.
Right.
Wisdom.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and it's overwhelming. Like, I'm an expert here, and I know it's overwhelming even for me. I had mentioned that 30-day parenting challenge before the last time I came on. And every day I would film and my kids would hear, and they're like, okay, so you're working on this today. You're going to listen to us, right, Mom? Right? And it's like, oh, it is so hard, this whole parenting thing. And so where do we start? And I know we're not in school right now, and so we don't have those opportunities. At the end of the day, I love the idea. There's a couple of things. I love the idea of the Michelangelo effect. And essentially, it's more to do with couples, but I really bring it down to families and parents with their kids. So what the Michelangelo effect is, it's really seeing your child's, the kind of the finished product of your child, so to speak. So normally when we get a diagnosis, your child has ADHD or autism, anytime I'm like, congratulations, your child has ADHD or high functioning autism. These are all the great reasons why it's fantastic. Because if we look at the successful adults with these diagnoses, they found their niche. And especially, you know, Steve Jobs is on the spectrum. He found his niche. He took Apple that was crumbling. They had so many products and he was able to narrow it down to where Apple is today, right? And so if you've seen the movie The Big Short, I think it's called, based on the true story of the housing economy collapsing back in early 2000s or mid 2000s, there was a gentleman, I can't remember the actor's name. Anyways, he had Asperger's and he could read like stacks of numbers, just numbers that nobody else bothered to deal with. He predicted the housing crisis was going to happen, right? And he ended up making the company he was working for billions to capitalize on it because he saw it coming. Everybody else tried to fire him, thought he was crazy. You know, there's no way that this housing collapse is going to happen. And then it did because he could analyze those numbers. So there's some great strengths. But unfortunately, when we get that diagnosis and when we're stuck in the heat of the moment with behaviors or whatever else is going on, we only see the deficit. Parents almost always cry in my office, even though I'm like, congratulations. It's just like, it's almost like it's a death sentence. It's like, dun, 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 the ball has dropped. And then we fall into grief, and that's normal. And grief, I think, comes a lot. I see it all the time, you know, friendships now, my daughter's in junior high, friendships are so important. And I can see if she doesn't get invited to that special sleepover, she's friends with everybody, but not best friends with anybody. Right. And so when a sleepover happens, it's just a couple of, you know, really close friends and she's not invited. That's a grieving process for me too, because she's being left out. Or if we see transitions that other kids are being able to make and our kids aren't, I mean, we go through this grieving process all the time and we're stuck in it. But then we're stuck in the deficits. So with the Michelangelo effect, it's seeing the greatness of our kids, right? And so it's being able to remember our kids and capitalize on when they're at their best, because when they're at their best, we're getting along, they're doing amazing things, right? We might be laughing and all of those types of things. And so when we're worrying about the future, we're almost kind of creating that self-fulfilling prophecy. The Michelangelo effect is seeing them graduate, seeing them being successful, being happy, being resilient, you know, all of those types of things. And so when we're able to shift, we actually are able to create that future for them a little bit easier. You know, if you've seen Kung Fu Panda, at the beginning of one of the movies, they make the prediction that that really scary tiger is going to escape, right? And then they all start panicking, and the little, I think, koala bear, whatever, sends the duck to go tell the prison that this, you know, make sure all the protection is up, that this guy can't escape the prison. But as the duck flies over the prison, a feather falls down into the cell. And that, just by them creating that chaos of worry, they created, you know, they fulfilled that prophecy. So we sometimes need to be careful. And then we're nitpicky. You know, if we're scared that they're going to fail their test, we're nitpicking them all the time. And then they're going to fail the test because they're so stressed out because we're over top of them, right? And so
that's me. That's awful.
Yeah.
Remember last time you said the no nag thing? Yeah.
Well, and the moms, I think I shared the research, I'll say it again, but so they had kids doing puzzles. The researchers had kids doing puzzles, and they were all hooked up to, you know, to check their heart monitoring, their breathing monitoring, and sweat glands and all of that. And the only thing they told moms was to not give their kids any feedback. Don't help your kids at all. Right? So the moms stood behind their kids as their kids were doing the puzzle. The kids happily were doing their puzzles, but the moms who were watching their kids, their anxiety levels as they're watching is going up. And they couldn't, 100% of them jumped in at some point, even if it was like, oh, you're so close. Oh no, just that one, go back, right? They just little things like that. But as soon as so their stress level was increasing, as soon as they were able to jump in and help their kids, their stress immediately dissipated. They felt better. They were relieved. But guess what? As soon as the moms jumped in, the kids were happy, mom jumped in, their stress went through the roof, and it stayed through the roof for the rest of the time. So moms thinking that they were helping actually stressed their kids out, right? And so that's why if there's so many things. I think last time I talked about too, those little, we're telling our kids we don't trust them to handle it on their own, right? You can't handle it. And that's why there's a lot more anxiety and dependency. They become dependent on us, always jumping in to help them. So with the Michelangelo effect, it's essentially, I do trust you. I know that you can be successful. I know that you've got these skills. I'm going to help you, support you in these ways, right? I think it takes a little bit of pressure off us in that regard, and we're not making things worse. But the biggest thing that it comes back to, if you're going to focus on anything, it's always the relationship. Your child's relationship with you is the number one predictor of long-term success. So you can worry about their reading now if you want. You can worry about these things, but their long-term success is your relationship with you. And so if your relationship with your kids is filled with stress and distraught and grief, and, you're not having much fun or joy, and there's days, we all have days. There's days that I do want to run away and just throw in the towel, and what's the point, right? I do so much for my kids, and they're just little jerks back, or whatever it is. It's just too much. We all have those days, but there's good times too, right? And I know that relationship. So if you're going to do anything, and I think COVID, I've talked about this before too, is a great reset button, right? It was a good reset. Yes, we were stuck at home, and yes, there was a lot of stresses, but it's a great opportunity to work on strengthening our relationship, right? And even if right now the only way you can find joy in your child is when your child's sleeping, that's okay, right? Capitalize, go and watch them sleep, right? They're usually at they're quiet and they're sweet, right? And you realize, there's a kid who needs my love right now. And usually when their behaviors are going through the roof and they're telling us we're awful and they're swearing at us and they're destroying the house, they need your love then too, more than any other time. It's just harder for us to be able to connect with them during those times. But, at the end of the day, it's our relationship. So if you're going to work on anything, it's going to be that. And I know we can stress about school and all of these other places, but this is the one thing we do have that we can control. And when it comes to school, they can learn skills at any time, right? My brother dropped out of high school, and he went back when he was motivated and became successful, right? Not that we want our kids dropping out or anything like that, but they will be more successful when we're able to give them that space to figure things out. I had one friend actually who she had a kiddo on the spectrum, and in high school, huge social anxiety, very high functioning, but she was always like, you got to get out, you got to get with the kids, and you got to, go to parties, and you got to at lunch be in the cafeteria. But it was so overwhelming for him. He liked being in the office, right? And he didn't care if he had friends, but the mom wanted him so bad to have friends and to be going to parties and doing all of these things. Until one day he's like, Mom, I am at my happiest in the office helping out. I get to interact with other students. I get to do all of these things. And then when she let go of that, you need to have lots of friends to be happy. And she realized, no, he actually has, a close family and extended little, relatives in those relationships. Then he was happy, right? And then they were able to get along, and she wasn't having these big emotional teenage meltdowns and all of those types of things. And so, it does come to a point where we got to ease up some of those reins, because we are holding them all so tight because we want everything to be perfect. But we're just going to create a big disaster if we do. So we got to let some of them go. If you've got younger kids, well, even older kids, that relationship's most important, and then kind of build from there.
Oh, this has been so good. And I really love how you just bring it back to the one person that we always have control over, which is ourselves, and the relationship we're building with them. You're so right. I mean, in resilience studies, that's it right there. Resilience studies say that kids have to have at least one adult in their lives, that they just know that there's a real connection there. And when they have that, they do thrive. And it might be an interesting journey. And I think sometimes I'm just remembering how I felt listening to messages like this when I was in the heat of our moment in our family. And it would just, I knew in my heart it was right, but it aggravated me. I think because we have to really check our motive for signing up for a webinar. Are we expecting someone to solve our children's problems? Are we expecting our children to change? Are we going through grief? Are we wishing that life wouldn't have handed us this? And that's what we're actually going through. You really are bringing these things to the surface. And I am thankful, like you mentioned, we have you as a friend of the Brave Parent Institute. You have your own practice. I would encourage anyone here today who's like, we didn't solve life's problems in an hour. Dr. Caroline is available. She has her practice. She's out there. She's accessible. And so please reach out to her. And then our Brave Parent Institute, that's what we're for. We're there so that when you do need to pick up your kid from the school and you don't know anyone, well, here you have a group. Here you have coaches and people who will walk you home and help you and figure it out and be in that messy middle with you, grieve with you, not try to solve your problem. Because we have to remember that professionals are there to give us professional help. Here's what you need to do. But getting there, the A to B is fun.
Yeah. Fun. Well, and that's why the network, I started with the network and I'll end with the network. That's why that's so important. And it's for you, but it's also for your kids. Your kids, you were saying that one relationship with adults, but let's have them have multiple relationships with adults. If they can connect with a coach or a grandma or an uncle or an aunt, I think that that's really important too. My daughter doesn't always come to me, my little one. She loves going to grandma, right? If she's had a rough day, she will come to me, but she's got two people. So if I'm unavailable, I think that's a network for us, but also that network for our kids, right? And especially our kids on the spectrum, they're usually more comfortable with adults. It's not just about the peer relationships, it's all of these other little relationships that they can have too. I think that's important.
Oh, I love that too. Yes. And now that things are lifting, we might be able to actually get together, which is great. Have a little backyard get together this summer. And if you're maybe not in our Brave Parent Institute, by all means, reach out to me. Dr. Caroline, can you write your whatever email in the chat there for people to reach you, or a website?
Sure.
Where you feel. And then our Brave Parent Institute, it is a monthly membership. So some people have been a little confused. But it's very, very minimal. We have made it so that the barrier of finance is not there, at least as much. And so there's Dr. Caroline. You could reach her there. This is the Brave Parent Institute if you want to reach us. But honestly, the biggest thing is don't do this alone, because oftentimes we just sink into our own feelings. Even people in our own Brave Parent Institute, I email when people don't show up to our Thursday nights. And oftentimes they don't show up because, we were having a rough night. I'm like, those are the nights to show up.
Yeah.
Don't hide, don't isolate, don't show up when everything's good. So that, I don't know why we do that, but we do that as humans.
All the things that we need to survive, exercising, eating right, they usually go out the window as soon as we're stressed. But unfortunately, you're right. That's exactly what we need to keep surviving and thriving.
Yeah. Well, that's awesome. Well, thank you. This has been amazing. It's been recorded. So I will be sending everyone the recording. And I just want to thank you so much again, Dr. Caroline. You're doing
no problem
work. I'm a big fan.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
You're
Take
welcome.
care.
Bye, everyone. Have a good week.
Bye.